All right, the next step in our glue ups, we've got all the stiles and rail pieces all glued up, and while those set up and dry, we're going to start gluing up the panels. Now, these are pretty large panels, but this is how they make cabinet doors that are solid panel, whether they be oak or cherry or poplar or whatever. Um, and whether they're raised panel or flat panel doesn't really matter, but they mostly do them, and you can look at your own cabinet doors if you happen to have solid wood panel doors. You can see the different pieces that have been compressed and glued together and then built up to make larger panels, and then those panels are cut. So in these barn doors, we're basically doing the same exact principle, except it's on a much larger scale. It turns out with the measurements that I need 11 1x4s that we're using, and the reason we're using 1x4 is because that's the style that the client wanted. We're going to actually groove down this. We're going to actually do a small V-notch groove in between each member of the panel. So instead of trying to hide the fact that we're gluing up a bunch of smaller pieces to make a larger panel, we're going to accentuate that by putting a groove down the seam between each of the two boards. And the reason they do this is, one, it looks decent, and I've seen this done in cabinets. Actually, it's a way to kind of disguise the fact that two boards are joined together and there may be a little bit of offset in the seam or something like that, or the seam is very obvious. Sometimes one of the ways to hide it is actually to bring it out and call attention to it, and then your mind ignores it after a while. So, all right, so in order to glue up these larger panels, I'm going to have to put all of these boards together, obviously, and one of the things that you're going to need to do this on a large scale are some pretty beefy clamps. I mean, these are clamps that have about a 50-inch clamping capacity. When they talk about clamping capacity, there's two dimensions really that they talk about for clamps. One is the throat depth, and then one is a clamping capacity. And the throat depth is obviously between the outside edge of the clamp, the distance between this outside edge of the clamp and the actual bar or pole or whatever, the pipe that you're using, pipe clamps. That's what they call the throat of the clamp, the throat depth. The clamping capacity is what they call when the clamp is completely open. Sorry. When the clamp is completely open, the distance between this pad and this pad, that's the clamping capacity. And since I've got about, I got 39 inches that I need to clamp here roughly, so I need something with at least 39 to 40 inches of clamping capacity. So I've got these larger clamps with 50-inch clamp capacity, and that's what I'm going to be using. Now, the other thing when you glue up panels, and this is where you start getting into some of the advanced tools that we're going to be using. Now, one thing that makes a good glue up of a panel like this is that there can be no air gaps between these boards. Because if you go look at your kitchen cabinets, if they happen to be solid center panels as well, you're going to see that there are a bunch of boards that are compressed together. There's no seam or gap between any of those. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that your edges are, the edges of these boards here are exactly flat and exactly 90 degrees to the surface of the wider surface of the board. And the only real way to achieve this is with something called a jointer or a planer. They're two different tools. If you happen to have either of them, that's fine. Again, you can do this with running them over a table saw, but you run the risk of having some, small gaps that you're going to have to fill later. Are they structurally bad if you run these on the table saw? No, they're not going to fall apart. Like I said earlier in the previous glue up, the glues today are so good that you'll tear the wood fibers out before you'll actually break the seam along the glue. So you can do it, but then you're just going to have to go back and fill the seams later, and if you're not really careful, it can look kind of bad. So one of the tools that we have, and I'm going to show you the portable version of it because I do have some portable advanced tools that I take on the job site with me if I'm doing, you know, job site builds or whatever. And this tool is called a jointer. And basically, I'm not going to go into an in-depth explanation too much of the whole jointer, but I do want to point out a couple of things. First of all, this is a benchtop jointer. As you can see, it's light enough for me to lift and move around if I need to. The way you set the table and the fence, they are exactly 90 degrees with respect to one another, so that when you run the board over the joining blade, it's going to create a perfectly 90-degree blade, and when you clamp those things together and glue them all up into one single panel, you will have no seams or gaps between the boards, and that is, to me, absolutely critical for a professional job. But again, like the novice yoga person that I am versus, you know, the advanced person, you know, you can do it on the table saw. You just may have, because the table saw, the blade doesn't always move 100% perfectly, so you may get these saw marks on the sides of your boards, and that's gonna create some air pockets, you know, on the micro level, really. But if it's truly 90 degrees and your table saw cuts beautifully and you're happy with it and it doesn't appear to leave too many saw marks, yes, you can get away with it without having a jointer. The other tool that we use in the shop is a planer. Again, I have a portable planer that I can bring on the job sites with me. Due to size constraints of my shop, it's actually pretty small. You know, as far as for, you know, custom commercial work, I guess is concerned, or not commercial, custom residential work, I often resort to benchtop tools because they take up less room, they're movable, and you know, I'm not doing like massive construction where I need big giant tools. Those tools occupy a lot of floor space in the shop. I just don't have the room for it. But anyway, the way this planer works, in addition to keeping the board 90 degrees on the face with respect to the fence, is it's got this rotating wheel of blades here, and basically what that rotating wheel does is it basically removes a very thin layer of the edge of the board, so it will remove all saw marks. And one side of the table is slightly higher than the other. So this table right now, I have it set up to be 1/32 of an inch higher than this half of the table. So when you run the board over it, it's essentially going to take up to a 1/32 of an inch off the edge of the board to make it flat. And that's obviously very adjustable over there. I can take up to a 1/16, but you know, you don't want to take off too much, particularly in this case because I need about 36 inches. So if I take off too much, I may end up shortening my panel to the point where it's too narrow to fit in the door that I'm making. So I want to be careful I do that. So I take off very little. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm not going to bother showing you all this planing, but if you do have a planer and not a jointer, you can basically do exactly the same thing. You can put these boards, you can stack them all together and put about 5 or 6 boards through the planer, and the planer knives will do exactly the same thing as the jointer will do on the edges of your board to make them, you know, perfect. Okay, so and some of these tools are actually, the benchtop versions are very affordable. I forget what this one costs, but I'm pretty sure it's less than $200. So if you do a lot of cabinet work or things like that that require jointing, not only can you do the edge of the board, actually, you can do the face of the board as well. You can run the face all along it. This is only like a 6-inch jointer, so if I had an 8-inch board or something like that, I couldn't run the whole 8-inch board over. It wouldn't even fit through here, first of all, but it would be hanging over the edge and it wouldn't get the whole thing, and you wouldn't do that. You need a planer, a larger planer or something like that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run each of the edges of these board through the jointer, and then I'm going to come back and I will show you the process of gluing up these panels. One thing I'll mention here, because a lot of people mention this on several of the videos that I've done, you know, dust collection is obviously very important. It's just as important as your eyes and your ears. So what I do is when this stuff is portable and I want to show, you know, videos of it, or I've got to take it on a job site, I just hook it into a shop vac. So I don't know if you can see it, but I've just got an old, like a rigid shop vac. Again, it doesn't matter, but it's a pretty big capacity because otherwise you'll be emptying the dust like all the time. And then each of these tools, these benchtop tools that I have, the planer and the jointer, they all have a dust port, which happens to be right back here. So you just hook in your shop vac, turn it on, and then start running the boards through, running them through the jointer. So I'll actually show you one very quickly, and then you never want to forget your eyes and ears too, but lungs are very important. If you don't have dust collection or means, just try to invest in a small one, even if it's just a little shop vac that you can hook up to the different pieces that you have, because overall it will help you, and some protection is better than none. I've gone ahead and jointed each edge of every single one of these boards, and I also did the edges on the boards for the next panel. So I'm going to show you the glue up of this panel and how it goes, and then I'll do the other one obviously off camera. Alright, one of the things that I wanted to talk about real quick is I've gone ahead and created another skill building video on how to make what's called a caul, C-A-U-L. And what a caul basically does, or is used for, is this caul is kind of just like a quick shop-made one. You can probably make or get, you know, more professional ones if you want, but this is, I find, pretty useful and good enough. So there is a skill building video on how to make these and how they're used if you want to see that. But I'm just going to explain them very briefly here. And essentially all they are two pieces of plywood that are sandwiched together, and between the plywood are some 1/2-inch thick spacers. There's a spacer at each end and one in the middle. And essentially what we do is we build 2 of these for each pair. We need two per setup for each caul. And the way it kind of works is you build these things such that you can get a bolt up through the underneath, and then you're going to put a washer over the top and some kind of a knob in order to tighten these down. And these aren't really the best knobs I could use. They're a little small, but you know, obviously the bigger the knob, the more torque you're going to have. But essentially how the cauls work is you put one of these cauls underneath the board, and then you feed your bolts up, you know, through the space. And the reason you put the spaces in is so that you can take the bolts and move them closer or further apart depending on how big your panel is. These are some pretty big panels that we're gluing up here. So we need the bolts just all the way at the end. It's about a 39-inch panel. Alright, so then what I'm going to do then is I would slip the caul over, kind of line them up here. I would take another fender washer, put it over the screw, and then I'll take this star knob and twist them down. And by doing that, on each side here, I'm going to obviously put, you know, a star here. You could use a wing nut if you want, but those usually take a little bit more, you know, thumb strength and finger strength. They kind of hurt if you're really cranking them down, and they're hard to loosen up, harder than the knobs are. But anyway, the idea of the caul then is to provide downward pressure across the surface of all of these boards in an attempt to get them, the surfaces, the edges next to one another, as flush as you possibly can. And you can use, you know, 5 of these cauls if you want. You can use 3. I'm going to be able to use 3 on this just because these boards are really kind of, except for this one in the middle, it's kind of reasonably straight, and we'll get this down as we apply pressure on the you know, on the clamps. And then once all 3 cauls are tightened down and the boards have glue on each of the edges, you're going to go ahead and take you know, one of your clamps, and then I have about 6 of these really long clamps. You can always use more. You just don't have enough, clamps in the shop ever. But anyway, then you're going to go ahead and take your large clamp, and you're going to clamp these over like so, and then you're just going to really tighten down on this clamp, drawing all the boards together and making a really good solid panel. You don't have to worry as much when you tighten down the caul to make these things flat. You can go ahead and give it a really good tight twist on these just to make them flush. This thing has far more torque on it than your hands on a little star knob, so it will draw them all together even though there's downward pressure on these cauls. Alright, so let me go ahead and get these taken care of off here. I'll set these to the side, and all I'm going to do now is basically, I'll hopefully figure out how to speed the video up a little bit. And all I'm going to do now is turn these boards on their sides and I'll glue one side on the end boards obviously, and then we'll start gluing both sides to all the other boards until we get everything kind of glued up together. And then we'll lay them all down and we'll get them compressed together. We'll put the cauls on, smash everything down so that the surfaces are flush here, and then we'll clamp everything together and we'll let it sit and dry overnight. Okay, that pretty much wraps it up for this first panel. It's a little tricky to get these boards aligned. Again, they're aligned enough to where a quick sanding should get rid of most of or any of the seams. Plus, as I may have mentioned earlier, we're going to be routing V-notch grooves or V-grooves into each of the edges between the panels to give it more of a kind of tongue and groove appearance without actually milling all the tongues and grooves. So that's it for this one. I'm going to go ahead and wait for this one to dry, and then I'll glue up the other panel. And then in the next video we'll see basically routing out the dados in the stiles and rails and cutting the panels to side, and then assembling the whole barn door. So I appreciate you watching, and stay tuned for the next video.